The mess hall was a cavern of noise, steel trays clattering, voices echoing in the high ceiling, the smell of overcooked beans and stale bread hanging thick in the air. 100 recruits moved about in restless lines, their uniforms wrinkled, their shoulders stiff from drills, their laughter sharp with the cruelty of young men who thought hardship gave them authority. In the far corner, at a table meant for 4 but occupied by only 1, sat a woman who seemed so out of place that most barely spared her a glance. She was not in uniform like the rest, not a recruit or a sergeant barking orders. She wore a plain gray dress, the sort of clothing that carried no brand, no insignia, no importance. Her hair was tied back in a simple knot, a few stray strands falling over her cheek, and her posture was quiet, reserved, her shoulders curved inwards as though she wanted to take up less space. She was eating slowly, mechanically, with no hint of urgency, her eyes fixed on her tray of bread and soup as though the meal was the most important task in the world. At first, no one cared about her presence. Recruits had enough on their minds with aching muscles and endless drills, but boredom and cruelty are quick companions, and when the group of 6 recruits at the nearest table noticed her, the whispers began. They were young, their heads still full of arrogance, not yet broken down by discipline. "Who let her in here?" one muttered, smirking. Another snorted, "Maybe she's lost. Kitchen staff or something. Looks like she should be scrubbing floors, not eating with us." Their laughter rose above the noise, and a few heads turned. The woman, however, gave no sign of hearing them. She continued dipping her bread into the soup, taking small, measured bites, her face expressionless. The recruits took her silence as weakness, and that weakness was an invitation. One of them, a tall boy with a shaved head and a voice that carried like a trumpet, pushed back his tray and swaggered over. He stopped at her table, casting his shadow across her meal. "Hey," he said loudly so that others nearby could hear, "you lost, Auntie? This is a soldier's mess hall. You're in the wrong place." His friends snickered behind him. The woman raised her eyes for the first time. They were calm, dark, and gave away nothing. She didn't answer. She simply looked at him, then back at her soup, as if his existence was a passing breeze she would not acknowledge. The recruit's grin widened. Rejection stung worse than words. "Did you hear me?" he said louder now, leaning closer. "Or maybe you don't understand. This is where soldiers eat. Soldiers. Not people who look like they wandered in from the street." Still she said nothing. She tore a piece of bread with her hands, dipped it carefully and chewed, unhurried. Around them, the noise began to dip, curiosity spreading like ripples across water. The recruits at the nearby tables stopped their chatter, sensing entertainment. A few sergeants at the far end glanced up but made no move. In places like this, lessons often taught themselves. The tall recruit glanced back at his friends, smirking at the attention. "Look at her," he jeered. "Too scared to speak. What's wrong, old woman? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too simple to understand." His companions chuckled, emboldened by his cruelty. One mimicked her slow way of eating, exaggerating each bite until the others nearly doubled over laughing. Another began to clap mockingly, as though her silence was a performance. But through it all she remained still, her face unreadable, her breathing steady. She swallowed her bread, set down her spoon and finally looked up. The recruits expected fear or anger, or at least a flustered defense. What they saw instead unsettled them, a gaze as steady as stone, a stillness that felt heavier than shouting. She tilted her head slightly, studying them as though they were curiosities in a jar. Then she spoke, and her voice was soft, almost too soft to cut through the noise, yet it carried in a way that froze the air. "Are you finished?" The tall recruit blinked. He hadn't expected her to speak at all, let alone with such calm. He tried to recover with a scoff. "Finished? Lady, we haven't even started." A ripple of laughter came from his friends. But the woman's eyes never left his, unblinking. She didn't smile, didn't frown. She simply waited as if the silence belonged to her, not to him. For reasons he couldn't name, he felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say more, to push harder, but words tangled uselessly in his mouth. One of his friends called out, "Show her her place, Jory." But Jory, the tall recruit, found himself hesitating. Her presence, simple as it was, pressed against him like an invisible weight. He cleared his throat, leaning closer to mask his unease. "You're in the wrong hall," he said, but the bite had gone from his tone. "Better finish up and leave before—" He stopped. Her hand had moved, not quickly, not violently, just a shift of fingers on the edge of the tray. Yet the motion was precise, controlled, deliberate. She placed her spoon down with care, as though setting a blade on a whetstone, and folded her hands in her lap. The recruits behind him stopped laughing. Something in the air had changed, subtle but undeniable, a shift in the atmosphere that made the mess hall feel smaller, quieter. The woman leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. "You mistake quiet for weakness," she said, her voice still calm. "That is your first lesson." The words were not loud, not harsh, but they cut through the air sharper than a sergeant's bark. A murmur ran through the room. Recruits exchanged glances, unsure. Jory tried to laugh it off, but it came out strained. "Lesson?" he said. "Lady, what could you possibly teach me?" She did not blink. "Respect," she said simply. And for a moment, the mess hall was silent. The silence that followed her words was the kind that weighed on a room, heavy and unsettling, the sort that made even the scraping of a fork sound like thunder. Jory shifted his stance, caught between pride and unease, his smirk faltering as though his mouth hadn't gotten the message from his brain that this moment was no longer his to command. His friends at the nearby table, so eager just moments before to laugh and encourage, now looked less sure. One of them muttered under his breath, "What the hell is this?" But no one moved to step forward. No one else dared to break that peculiar stillness. The woman remained seated, her hands still folded neatly in her lap, her back straight but not rigid, her face calm as if she were waiting for them to recognize something obvious that their arrogance had blinded them to. Her eyes were steady, unblinking, the eyes of someone who had seen men like them 100 times before and found them predictable. Finally, Jory barked a laugh, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "Respect?" he said, forcing the word out as if it were ridiculous. "Lady, I don't need a lesson in respect from—" He didn't finish. Something about the way she tilted her head slightly to the side silenced him, as though she had already dismissed his words before he could even form them. Her gaze pierced through his bravado like glass through paper, and in it was no malice, no anger, just an unnerving patience. As if she could wait out his arrogance until he ran out of steam on his own. The other recruits grew restless. One of Jory's friends, a lean boy with sharp features and a nervous laugh, tried to salvage the show. He called out, "Maybe she's deaf, Jory? You should shout louder. Or maybe she's dumb, doesn't even understand what's happening." The others chuckled weakly, though the sound lacked the strength it had moments ago. Even they sensed something wrong in this little game they had started, though they didn't yet understand what. The woman, however, did not look at the speaker. Her eyes remained on Jory, her focus unbroken, like a spotlight pinning him in place. And for the first time since his training began, Jory felt small. Not because of rank, not because of orders shouted at him on the field, but because this quiet woman in a gray dress had decided he was not worth more than a test. He tried again, his voice harsher now, laced with frustration. "Respect is earned," he snapped, "and you haven't earned a damn thing." That was when she finally moved. It wasn't sudden, wasn't violent. She simply rose from her seat, slow and deliberate, her hands resting briefly on the table before sliding down to her sides. She wasn't tall, Jory had at least a head on her, but the moment she stood, the air shifted again as though gravity itself bent around her. Conversations in the hall ceased altogether. The clatter of trays stopped. Even the sergeants who had been pretending not to notice now turned fully toward the scene. The woman smoothed the front of her dress with both palms, a small, almost unnecessary gesture that only emphasized her composure. Then she stepped closer to Jory, closing the distance until she stood just a foot away. He braced himself for some outburst, some trembling voice or desperate plea for space. Instead, she spoke with the same calm, measured tone as before. "You speak of earning respect," she said. "And yet you think mockery earns you strength. You are still children, hiding cruelty and laughter because you fear silence will reveal your weakness." The words stung sharper than any shouted insult. A ripple went through the recruits, some scoffing under their breath, others shifting uncomfortably, but not one dared to laugh aloud this time. Jory's jaw tightened. He tried to sneer, but the heat rising in his chest betrayed him. He stepped forward, puffing himself up, looming over her as though sheer size could restore what he was rapidly losing. "You don't know a thing about strength," he growled. Her expression didn't change. She tilted her chin slightly upward to meet his glare, utterly unmoved by his height or his tone. "Do you?" she asked simply. Jory's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His mind scrambled for an answer, but the question was too direct, too cutting. It sliced past his bravado and dug into something raw, something he didn't have the words to cover up. The mess hall watched, breath held as the silence stretched. Then she moved again, faster this time, but not in the way anyone expected. Her hand darted out, not to strike him, but to the tray on the table beside her. In one fluid motion, she flicked her wrist and sent the metal spoon that had rested there clattering against the floor several feet away. The sound was sharp, echoing, startling enough that half the recruits flinched. Before Jory could react, she spoke again. "Strength," she said, her voice still calm, still steady, "is not loud. It is not cruel. It is not the laughter of boys trying to prove themselves to other boys. Strength is measured in control, in discipline, in knowing when to act and when to hold still." The spoon spun to a stop on the floor, its metallic ring fading into silence. The recruits stared, their arrogance unraveling with every word. Jory clenched his fists, his pride screaming at him to push back, but something deeper held him frozen. Something about her presence, about the deliberate way she had shattered the moment with nothing more than a spoon, rooted him to the spot. One of the sergeants at the far end of the hall finally stepped forward. His boots thudded against the floor, and the recruits straightened instinctively at the sound. He was a broad man with a scar running across his cheek, his voice rough from years of shouting. "Enough," he barked. "Back to your tables, all of you." But the woman lifted a hand, just a small, graceful motion, and the sergeant stopped mid-step. To the astonishment of every recruit in the room, he did not continue forward. Instead, he gave a slight nod as though acknowledging her authority and returned to his place. A murmur ran through the recruits like a wave. They exchanged bewildered glances, trying to piece together what they had just seen. Who was this woman that even a hardened sergeant deferred to her? Jory swallowed hard, his throat dry. He no longer cared about putting on a show for his friends. He just wanted the weight of her eyes off him. But she wasn't finished. "You are here to become soldiers," she said, turning her gaze slowly to sweep over the entire hall. "Not bullies. Not cowards hiding behind numbers. Soldiers. And a soldier who does not understand respect will never understand strength. You will fail each other. You will fail yourselves." The words landed heavier than any punishment they'd ever received. No shouting, no threats of extra drills, just a simple truth delivered in a voice that demanded belief. Jory stepped back, his pride finally breaking, but she followed him with her eyes, unrelenting. "One day," she said softly, "you will wish you had listened. And when that day comes, you will remember this moment. Not because I embarrassed you, but because you embarrassed yourselves." The mess hall was silent again. Truly silent. No laughter, no whispers, only the sound of recruits breathing in tense, uneven rhythm. For the first time Jory lowered his gaze. He couldn't look at her any longer. He mumbled something under his breath, something meant to be an apology but too broken to be clear. The woman gave no acknowledgement. She simply stepped back to her table, sat down, and picked up her bread again as though nothing had happened. She resumed her meal in silence, calm and deliberate, while the rest of the hall stared in uneasy awe. The recruits who had mocked her moments ago couldn't bring themselves to speak. Their food went untouched. Their laughter, their arrogance, had withered away, leaving behind only the bitter taste of humiliation. But deeper than humiliation was something else, something none of them wanted to admit out loud. Fear. Fear was a strange thing in the mess hall that day. It did not roar or scream, it settled like a fog over the recruits, clinging to their skin and sinking into their bones. They did not want to admit it even to themselves, but it was there, born not from violence, not from threats, but from the unsettling realization that they had misjudged entirely who they were dealing with. The woman had returned to her seat, calm as before, her bread and soup once again the center of her attention, and yet she had become the center of theirs. Every small motion of her hands seemed amplified, every soft chew louder than their own pounding hearts. They had thought her simple, thought her weak, and now the certainty that they had mocked someone far greater than them chewed at their confidence like rats in the dark. Jory could not shake her eyes from his mind. He tried staring down at his tray, tried focusing on the bland potatoes cooling in their watery sauce, but every time he blinked, he saw her gaze again, steady, unyielding, patient in a way that made his stomach twist. He remembered the way she had silenced him with nothing but a question. "Do you?" It echoed still, louder than the sergeant's whistles, louder than the drills, louder than any command he had ever obeyed. He had no answer then, and he had no answer now. He clenched his fists under the table, his pride bleeding into something uglier, shame. Around him the others fared no better. The lean boy with the sharp features who had mocked her eating habits earlier now sat stiffly, not daring to lift his eyes. The ones who had laughed the loudest now shifted in their seats, their shoulders hunched, suddenly smaller. A few others, who had only been spectators, now whispered among themselves, voices hushed with curiosity and something close to reverence. It was one of those whispers that carried the first hint of truth. "Do you think she's someone, a recruit at the far table muttered. His companion leaned closer. She has to be. Did you see how the sergeant stopped? He never stops for anyone. Ever. The speculation spread, quiet but insistent. The more they thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit together. She wasn't dressed like staff, wasn't moving like a stranger. Everything about her had been deliberate, the way she ignored them, the way she spoke, the way she moved. She hadn't defended herself, she had taught them something, like a lesson she had delivered 1,000 times before. And yet, despite the questions, none dared to ask her. She sat there still, eating in silence, her presence a wall none of them wanted to test again. But discipline, once broken, does not reassemble so easily. Among the recruits, there were always some who feared shame less than they feared surrendering their pride. One of Jory's companions, a broad-shouldered boy named Branik, leaned close to him and hissed, "We can't just let her sit there after that. Everyone's staring at us like we're cowards." Jory's jaw tightened. His pride screamed the same thing, but his gut churned with dread. He had already felt the weight of her words, and though he would never admit it aloud, he knew better than to push again. "Leave it," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual steel. But Branik was not so easily deterred. His arrogance was the reckless kind, the kind that mistook silence for victory. He pushed up from the bench, his chair screeching loudly against the floor, drawing the attention of half the room. His chest puffed, his voice raised. "So what are you supposed to be, huh? Some wise old woman teaching us lessons? You think you're better than us?" The mess hall froze again. Jory cursed under his breath. He wanted to drag Branik back down, but his limbs felt heavy, his throat too dry to call out. All eyes swung back to the corner where she sat. This time the woman did not even look up. She tore another piece of bread, dipped it into the last of her soup and ate it calmly. Her silence was sharper than any insult, more cutting than any retort. Branik's face flushed red. He took her lack of acknowledgement as dismissal, and dismissal was something his pride could not tolerate. "I'm talking to you," he barked, slamming his fist onto her table. The trays rattled, the soup rippled, but her spoon remained steady in her hand. Slowly, deliberately she raised her gaze. There it was again, that look. Steady, calm, patient. Not angry, not afraid, not even annoyed. Just certain. Certain in a way that made Branik's words stumble before they even reached his lips. She set her spoon down once more, folded her hands in her lap, and regarded him as one might regard a child throwing a tantrum. "You have learned nothing," she said, her voice soft but ringing through the silence. "And so, you will learn harder." Branik blinked. "Learn?" He didn't finish. She stood, smoother this time, and for the first time since entering the hall, her movements carried weight, subtle, controlled, but undeniable. She stepped around the table and into the open space between her corner and the recruits' cluster. The crowd shifted instinctively, chairs scraping back, as though the room itself wanted to give her space. Branik tried to straighten, tried to hold on to his bluster, but her approach withered it. She stopped a mere step away, tilting her head slightly upward to meet his glare. Then without warning she moved. Her hand shot up, not to strike, not to hurt, but to grasp his wrist with startling precision. In one fluid motion, she twisted, and before anyone could process it, Branik was on his knees, his arm bent back at an angle that screamed of pain but stopped just short of breaking. His mouth opened in a strangled gasp, his pride shattering under the weight of sudden helplessness. The recruits around them jumped to their feet, shock freezing them in place. No one moved to help him. No one dared. She leaned slightly closer, her voice calm, almost gentle. "Strength is not in how loudly you demand to be heard. It is in control. Of yourself, and of others when they lose theirs." Then, as smoothly as she had taken him down, she released him. Branik crumpled onto both knees, clutching his wrist, his face pale with shock and humiliation. She straightened her dress, smoothed her hair and stepped back. The hall erupted, not in laughter this time but in stunned whispers, in fearful glances, in a respect that none of them had expected to feel. Even the sergeants remained silent, their faces unreadable, though in their eyes was something the recruits had never seen before: acknowledgement. The woman did not revel in the display. She did not gloat, did not scold further. She simply returned to her table and sat once more, finishing her meal with the same quiet calm. And the recruits, every single one of them, finally understood. They had not mocked a simple woman. They had mocked their teacher. The mess hall did not return to normal after that moment. Even though trays still held food and spoons hovered over plates, the appetite had drained out of everyone. Branik remained on his knees, his broad shoulders slumped, his breath ragged as he clutched the wrist she had twisted with such effortless precision. No one dared to laugh at him, though a few recruits cast sidelong glances, the same way one might glance at a wounded animal and wonder how close it was to breaking. For the first time since their training began, arrogance had no place to cling to. Jory sat rigid, his jaw tight, his thoughts a storm. A part of him wanted to sneer at Bronick for being foolish enough to push her, but the truth burned deeper. He knew it could have been him just as easily. He had been the first to mock her, the first to step forward. If she had chosen him instead of Bronick, he would have been the one kneeling, humiliated, exposed. The weight of that realization pressed against his chest like iron. Around the hall, whispers spread like wildfire. She dropped him like nothing. Did you see how fast? She didn't even look angry. The words buzzed low, but they were relentless, feeding into one another, creating an energy that filled every corner of the room. Some whispered with awe, others with unease, but none with laughter. The sergeants remained at their posts, their silence as telling as the recruits' fear. They did not interfere, did not scold or bark orders to restore order. Instead they watched her, their eyes sharp, their faces still. It was not the expression of men caught off guard. It was the look of soldiers who recognized something familiar, something dangerous, something they knew better than to interrupt. The woman herself remained the picture of composure. She sat once more, adjusted the tray so it sat square in front of her, and calmly lifted her spoon again. It was as if the confrontation had been nothing more than a brief interruption, a momentary inconvenience between bites of soup. She ate with the same deliberate calm, every movement unhurried, her breathing steady. To the recruits that was perhaps the most unnerving part of all. She had not raised her voice, had not broken a sweat, had not lost her temper. She had dismantled Bronick with the same energy one might use to correct a crooked chair. Eventually Bronick staggered back to his feet. His pride screamed for him to lash out again, to prove that he had not been broken. But the pain in his wrist, the memory of how easily she had controlled him, silenced that urge. His face flushed red, not with anger but with shame, and he shuffled back toward his table without another word. No one mocked him. No one even dared to look directly at him. The silence of his defeat hung over all of them like a shadow. Minutes ticked by, though it felt longer, heavier. Finally, one of the recruits from a distant table, the kind who had not participated in the mockery but had watched everything unfold, worked up the courage to whisper the question that had been on everyone's mind. Who is she? The words carried farther than intended, echoing in the quiet. Heads turned. No answer came. The sergeants did not speak, the woman did not acknowledge it, and the recruits, still reeling from what they had seen, had no explanation to offer. But the question dug into them like a thorn. Who was she? She looked ordinary, plain even. No medals, no insignia, no uniform. A simple dress, simple hair, simple presence. And yet she had silenced an entire hall of young men with nothing but words, broken one of the strongest among them with nothing but a single hand. The contradiction gnawed at them. A few of the recruits exchanged hushed theories. Maybe she's an instructor in disguise. Or a veteran, they say some of the old ones come back to watch training. No, she can't be. She looks ordinary. The last word hung, but even as it was spoken, it felt wrong. Ordinary women did not move like that. Ordinary women did not speak like that. Ordinary women did not bend men like Bronick into submission as if swatting a fly. Jory's thoughts spun darker. His pride, already battered, clawed desperately for an answer that made sense. He couldn't accept that she was simply stronger, wiser, better. He needed a reason, something to explain away his own failure. Maybe she's just a trickster, he muttered under his breath. Caught Bronick off guard, that's all. But even as he said it, the words tasted hollow. Deep down he knew it wasn't true. Bronick hadn't been caught off guard. He had been dismantled. There was a difference, and the difference gnawed at Jory more than he wanted to admit. At the far end of the hall, one of the sergeants finally moved. He was an older man, his hair silver at the temples, his posture still sharp as steel. He stepped forward with measured steps, the echo of his boots commanding the room. The recruits straightened instinctively, bracing for his voice to cut through the silence. But when he stopped near her table, his expression was one the recruits had never seen him wear before: respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but carrying, "shall I escort you?" The recruits froze. "Ma'am?" The word landed like a hammer blow. Sergeants did not call anyone ma'am. Not kitchen staff, not visitors, not outsiders. That was a word reserved for officers, for those above them, for people the recruits had no right to question. The woman finished her soup, placed her spoon neatly on the tray, and dabbed her lips with the corner of a napkin. Then she rose, smooth and unhurried, and gave the sergeant a small nod. "That won't be necessary," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent in it now, something the recruits could not miss. Authority. Command. Power that did not need to be flaunted because it simply was. She turned, her gaze sweeping once more over the room. The recruits straightened instinctively, spines rigid, as though their bodies understood what their pride refused to admit. Her eyes lingered for a moment on Jory, then on Brannick and finally across the rest of the room. She did not need to speak. The message was already etched into their bones. They had mocked her once and it would be the last time. Without another word, she stepped toward the exit, her footsteps light but carrying more weight than the stomps of boots that usually filled the hall. The sergeant stood back, giving her a clear path, his posture respectful. And then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. The silence that followed was crushing. The recruits sat stiff, trays cooling in front of them, their pride in shambles. No one dared to speak. No one dared to laugh. The room, once a cavern of noise, felt like a tomb. Finally, Brannick broke the silence with a bitter hiss. "Who the hell is she?" No one answered. But every recruit in that hall knew one thing. Whoever she was not simple. And whatever they thought they knew about strength, about respect, about power, they had just been proven wrong. The mess hall settled into an uneasy quiet the next day. The recruits who had laughed at her the hardest were suddenly the ones keeping their heads low, pushing food around their trays instead of daring to throw jabs. Some of the others, curious but still proud, watched her every move with the sort of suspicion soldiers usually reserved for unpredictable commanding officers. She, on the other hand, behaved as if nothing had happened. The woman walked in, quiet and steady, tray in hand, eyes cast down, not timidly but with an awareness that rattled those who saw her. She was no longer invisible. They couldn't write her off as just a cook, just a cleaner, just a servant who happened to share the same space. They had seen enough to know she was something else. That was precisely what unsettled them most. Soldiers live by categories. They understand enemy, comrade, superior, inferior. This woman fit none of those neat boxes. She had shown strength but refused to flaunt it. She had displayed control but not dominance. She had defended herself without any need to prove herself. Her silence made them louder inside their own heads. They had learned in training that fear of the unknown is sharper than fear of the known, and now they were living it. Two recruits in particular, Jonas, the loud one who had first mocked her, and Reeve, who had egged him on, had the hardest time swallowing their pride. They were the kind who measured themselves against everyone around them. For men like that, humiliation didn't fade, it rotted. At breakfast they sat together, whispering, their forks stabbing at eggs they didn't taste. "She embarrassed us in front of everyone," Jonas muttered, his jaw tight. "If we let this stand, we'll never hear the end of it." Reeve, slower but equally stubborn, nodded. "She's not even military. Just a woman who scrubs pants. And she thinks she can outdo us." His voice carried, and though no one responded, several heads turned. They knew a challenge when they heard one. The woman, sitting at her usual corner table, didn't react. She ate with measured bites, as if she hadn't heard, as if the buzzing of flies was no more distracting than this talk. That infuriated Jonas more than if she'd stood and called him out again. He wanted acknowledgement, some sign she cared. Instead, she remained a wall he could not scale. By the end of the meal, Jonas slammed his tray down and barked across the hall. "If you're so strong, why don't you prove it outside? Training yard after drills. Or are you afraid?" The room froze. No one dared laugh, though some wanted to, because Jonas's voice carried more desperation than bravado. The woman's eyes lifted, slow and deliberate, and for the first time that morning she looked directly at him. The stare was calm, unwavering, and it held long enough to make Jonas shift in his seat. Finally she spoke, "I do not waste strength on foolish contests. But if you insist on testing yourself, meet me there. You may learn something you do not expect." She turned away and continued eating, leaving the words hanging in the air like smoke. That afternoon, when drills ended, the recruits gathered in the yard. It was a dusty rectangle of packed dirt, ringed with posts and ropes, where soldiers sparred with padded sticks or trained hand to hand. This time, however, no instructor supervised. The crowd had come for a different kind of lesson. The woman stood at one end, her posture relaxed, her plain uniform still bearing faint marks of kitchen work. Jonas strutted to the center, chest puffed out, his body gleaming with sweat from the day's drills. He grabbed a practice staff, twirling it with unnecessary flourishes meant to intimidate. Reeve clapped him on the shoulder and stepped back, smirking. She did not arm herself. The recruits murmured at that. Some whispered that it was arrogance. Others whispered it was stupidity. Jonas smirked, believing he already had the upper hand. "You'll regret not taking a weapon," he sneered. The woman's only response was to step forward, hands loose at her sides. "Attack." Jonas lunged, swinging the staff in a wide arc meant to end things in one blow. To the spectators, it happened in a blink. She sidestepped, her hand shot out, and the staff flew from his grip before he even registered the contact. The weapon clattered to the dirt, and Jonas stumbled forward into empty space. Before he could recover, she pressed one hand to his shoulder and guided him down, face first, to the ground. It was not a violent slam. It was the way an adult restrains a child throwing a tantrum, controlled, efficient, humiliating. The yard went silent. Jonas struggled, his face burning, but her grip was like iron. Finally she released him, stepping back. "Strength without discipline is weakness," she said evenly, her voice carrying to every corner. "You train your bodies but not your minds. That is why you fall." Jonas scrambled up, fury eclipsing reason. He lunged barehanded this time, fists swinging wildly. Again she moved with almost casual ease. She let him exhaust himself in a flurry of punches that struck only air, then trapped his arm, twisted, and sent him sprawling with a sweep of her leg. He hit the dirt hard, gasping for breath. The recruits watching shifted uneasily. Some looked away. Others couldn't tear their eyes from the scene. Reeve shouted from the edge of the ring, "Get up! Don't let her beat you like that." But Jonas stayed down, panting, his pride more bruised than his body. Finally, he staggered to his feet and glared at her. His voice cracked when he spoke. What are you?" The woman met his gaze. Someone who learned long ago that the greatest battles are not won with fists, but with restraint. She turned her back on him and walked toward the edge of the yard. The crowd parted in silence as she passed. No one laughed. No one cheered. Respect had settled into the air like dust after a storm. That night, the barracks buzzed with whispered speculation. Some said she must have been special forces once, maybe even a veteran of wars they only read about in training manuals. Others swore she moved like the monks from the mountain provinces, trained in secret disciplines that ordinary soldiers couldn't grasp. No one knew the truth and she offered no explanations. Her silence only deepened the aura around her. Even Jonas, humiliated and seething, could not shake the memory of how easily she had undone him. His anger had transformed into something he couldn't admit, fear. In the days that followed, the recruits' behavior changed. They grew quieter, more disciplined, less prone to the loud bravado that had once filled the mess hall. The instructors noticed and said nothing, perhaps pleased by the sudden seriousness. The woman continued her routine, working, eating, moving silently between spaces as if untouched by the storm she had caused. Yet the recruits now gave her wide berth, not out of scorn but out of something closer to reverence. When she entered the hall, conversations dipped. When she passed in the yard, eyes followed her, but no one dared speak. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of orange and red, a young recruit named Cale approached her. Unlike the others, he carried no arrogance, no need to prove himself. He simply bowed his head slightly and asked, "Will you teach me?" The woman studied him for a long moment. Then, softly, she answered, "Only if you are willing to unlearn what you think you know." That single line spread through the barracks faster than rumor. And for the first time, the recruits wondered if perhaps the lesson she offered was one they all needed, not just to survive training, but to become something greater than soldiers who mocked out of ignorance. The mess hall was still buzzing from the earlier confrontation, the echoes of laughter and gasps lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. What had started as a casual lunch break had turned into something no one could easily forget. The recruits, who had once looked at Mara with disdain and mockery, now sat in stunned silence whenever she passed. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced by uncertainty, their smirks exchanged for tight-lipped expressions. It was as though the walls themselves remembered her words and the weight behind them. Mara, however, remained unshaken. She carried her tray with quiet dignity, eating slowly, her eyes always distant, as if she were listening to voices that no one else could hear. That afternoon, the training yard was called to order. Sergeant Keller barked commands, his gravelly voice cutting through the cool air. "Form ranks. Move like soldiers, not sheep," he shouted, his boots striking the dirt like thunder. The recruits scrambled into formation, their movements uncoordinated, betraying how new they still were to discipline. Mara moved last, not out of hesitation but out of calm precision, her steps measured and deliberate. She stood at the far end of the line, her eyes fixed forward, her face expressionless. The drill began with physical conditioning, push-ups, sprints, squats. Most groaned, sweating profusely, their breaths ragged after only minutes. Mara, though not the youngest or strongest, kept perfect rhythm. Each push-up was steady, every sprint controlled, her breaths deep and even. The recruits who had mocked her at lunch found themselves faltering beside her. Marcus, one of the louder ones from earlier, collapsed to his knees during the run, his chest heaving. He looked over at Mara, expecting to see her struggling. Instead, he saw her stride past him, her expression calm, her hair damp with sweat but her pace unbroken. That single glance cut deeper than any insult could. "Get up, Marcus," Keller barked. "What are you doing on the ground? You think the battlefield waits for weak lungs?" Marcus scrambled back to his feet, shame burning through him. The others pushed themselves harder, stealing glances at Mara, realizing she wasn't just enduring, she was excelling. Then came the hand-to-hand drills. Pairs were called forward to spar. The recruits shifted uneasily, already sore from the morning's punishment. Keller eyed the group like a predator pointing at random. Yo. In the ring. They went at each other clumsily, fists swinging wildly, feet slipping in the dirt. Some landed lucky hits, others crumpled fast. It wasn't about winning, it was about showing grit. Finally, Keller's eyes landed on Mara. "You," he said, his voice deliberate. "And you." His finger moved toward Adrian, the tallest recruit, broad-shouldered and arrogant even after being humbled earlier. Adrian smirked, rolling his shoulders. "Finally," he muttered. "Let's see if the quiet lady still has something to say." The circle tightened around them, the recruits whispering to one another. Mara stepped into the center slowly, her feet silent on the dirt, her hands hanging loosely by her sides. Adrian squared off, bouncing on his heels, fists raised. Keller barked, "Begin." Adrian lunged first, swinging a heavy fist meant to end it quickly. Mara shifted just an inch, his strike cutting through empty air. The force of his own momentum nearly sent him stumbling, but he caught himself and swung again, faster this time. Mara ducked low, her movements fluid, almost effortless. The recruits gasped. Adrian cursed under his breath, frustrated that he hadn't even brushed her clothing. Then, without warning, Mara struck. Not with brute force but with precision. A sharp jab to Adrian's ribs stole his breath. Before he could recover, she twisted, catching his arm and pulling him forward, using his own strength against him. He slammed into the dirt face first, choking on dust. The recruits roared in shock. Adrian scrambled up, his pride more bruised than his body. He charged again, reckless, his fists a storm. But Mara wasn't there. She moved like water, flowing around him, striking only when necessary. A hook to his jaw. A sweep of his leg. Another thud into the dirt. Adrian groaned, his bravado shattered, sweat dripping from his brow. "Enough." Keller barked, though his eyes betrayed the faintest glimmer of admiration. "Fight's over." The recruits stared in stunned silence. Adrian staggered back to the line, his head lowered, his jaw tight. No one dared laugh. No one dared mock. Mara, for her part, returned to her place quietly as though nothing had happened. She brushed a bit of dust from her sleeve and stood straight, her face unreadable. That night, the dormitory was quieter than usual. The recruits who once chattered and joked late into the night now whispered in hushed tones. Some stole glances at Mara, who sat on her bunk, repairing a small tear in her uniform with needle and thread. Her hands moved with the same calm precision she had shown in the yard. It was as though nothing could shake her balance. Finally, one of the recruits, Elena, a sharp-eyed girl who had mocked Mara during lunch earlier that day, spoke up. "Why don't you fight back more?" she asked, her voice low, uncertain. You could have crushed Adrian." Mara looked up from her stitching, her gaze steady but soft. "A soldier doesn't fight to humiliate," she said quietly. "A soldier fights to end what must be ended. Nothing more." The room went silent again. Her words carried weight, heavier than any lecture Keller had given them. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed of how they had treated her. The following days changed everything. Where once Mara had been the butt of jokes, she became the quiet standard everyone measured themselves against. During runs, recruits pushed harder to keep pace with her steady stride. During drills, they tried to mimic her focus. Even Adrian, though still bitter, no longer smirked when she passed. Respect, reluctant at first, began to settle among them like dust after a storm. But respect was only the beginning. Keller, too, had noticed. One afternoon, after dismissing the recruits, he called out, "Mara, stay a moment." The others filed out, exchanging curious glances. Mara stood where she was, waiting. Keller approached, his boots crunching in the gravel. He studied her for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. "You're different," he said finally. "Not just from them. From most." Mara said nothing, her eyes calm, meeting his without flinching. "I don't know where you came from and I don't care," Keller went on. "But I see it. Discipline. Control. That's something the army can't always teach. It's something forged elsewhere." He paused. "Don't waste it." Mara gave a small nod. "I won't." As she walked back to the dorms that evening, she felt the recruits' eyes follow her, not with scorn but with something else. Some with admiration. Some with unease. But all with recognition. She was no longer the simple woman they had mocked. She was something they couldn't yet define, but they knew enough to tread carefully. And deep down, though none of them dared admit it, they wondered who she truly was, and what battles had carved her into the unshakable force now standing among them. The training ground had grown quieter after the chaos of the afternoon, but an unusual kind of silence lingered in the air, a silence thick with unease. The recruits had laughed in the morning, mocked without restraint, treated her as though she were a harmless curiosity placed in their midst for them to ridicule. But now, as evening shadows stretched across the compound, the same recruits stole glances at her from across the mess hall, careful not to meet her eyes directly. The events that had unfolded had left them unsettled, and though no one spoke of it openly, every face carried the weight of realization. This woman was not what they thought she was. She sat alone at a corner table as she had before, quietly eating her simple meal. No one dared approach with insults now. Some whispered, some stared, some turned away quickly if she happened to glance in their direction. The power dynamic had shifted in a way none of them had anticipated. It wasn't brute strength that had done it, it was something else, something quieter, sharper, and infinitely harder to define. That scared them more than any display of violence could have. One recruit, a boy not much older than 20, pushed his tray aside and leaned forward, speaking in a low voice to his friends. She didn't even raise her voice. Didn't even move fast. And still, look what she did. His words carried a mix of awe and fear, as though he was still trying to convince himself it had really happened. Another scoffed, though his bravado was thin. "Maybe we let her get in our heads. That's all. A trick." But the first recruit shook his head. "A trick doesn't leave you gasping for breath. A trick doesn't make you feel like your chest is caving in, like the air itself is against you. No, it wasn't a trick." At the far end of the table, the sergeant sat silently, eating his meal with deliberate calm. His expression was unreadable, but his presence carried the weight of authority that kept the recruits from pressing the argument further. They knew better than to question too loudly under his watchful eye. Still, whispers buzzed beneath the surface, threads of doubt, fear, and reluctant respect weaving into something that none of them could quite put into words.